In this seminar, we're going to be going over how to come up with points for a constructive speech in a BP debate. So first, we're going to be going over a couple of general concepts that are helpful to keep in mind, regardless of whether or not we're making constructive or rebuttal arguments. Then we're going to be walking through a couple of very common motions that we see at debate tournaments, and finally, we'll be ending off with a couple of tips and tricks. So starting with some general concepts. First, on this question of quality versus quantity. If you can accurately identify the main issues or points of clash around a debate, that can take you further than having numerous arguments that are less fleshed out. So next, there are a couple questions that you can ask yourself as you're coming up with some arguments during your prep time. And to illustrate what I mean through these 4 questions, we'll be using an example motion. This House believes that artists from underrepresented backgrounds should reject accolades from established awards shows. So the first question we want to ask ourselves is, who are the actors that are applicable to this debate? What do they want? How can this motion impact them? How are they going to respond to this motion being enacted? Some of the actors that you can talk about are, for example, the actor who is actually enacting this motion, or it can also be actors that would be impacted by this motion, or actors that have an interest in this motion. So using our example, some stakeholders for this motion could be the artists that are accepting the awards or rejecting the awards. They could be other artists in the industry. It could be the institution that is giving out the awards, or it could even be the audience members that are watching these awards shows that may or may not identify from the same background as the artist. The next thing we want to ask ourselves is, what is the issue that this motion is trying to address? So sometimes if you find yourself a little bit stuck, you want to think about why the motion was set in the first place. And you can probably come up with a lot of constructive points just by describing very clearly what the actual problem is in this debate. Using our example once again, you can probably come up with a lot of points just by describing what the problems of underrepresentation actually look like in Hollywood, right? So how this can impact artists, how it can impact audiences when they're consuming this kind of artwork, and how it is that underrepresentation can kind of persist in Hollywood. So the next question you want to answer is how this motion actually addresses the issue. So why is it that rejecting an award from an esteemed award show is beneficial towards your cause? How is it going to actually change the way things are done in Hollywood? Or on opposition, why is it that it won't change, or why is it that this is going to make things worse? The final question you want to answer is, what are some alternatives? So if you're on the government side, you want to explain why it is that this motion is the best way to achieve the kind of change that you are advocating for. If you're on opposition, you can probably come up with some alternative ways of achieving the change you want, and you also want to explain why it is that these alternative ways are more effective than the motion that is proposed by government. So using our motion as an example again, the opposition team could probably say something like, you can get the same kind of change that government wants by accepting awards, because if you are at an awards show, you probably have a bigger platform during your acceptance speech. Or you can say that you can talk about the problems that you're facing during interviews and such, while also accepting the awards that you were given. Whereas on government side, you'd want to say why giving a speech or giving interviews is not as effective as an outright rejection of the award that you were given. So moving on to some common motion types. This House believes that. In these kind of motions, the House is usually undefined. It's usually broader society, so that means you have a bit more leeway in the stakeholders that you choose to talk about and who you choose to prioritize in terms of stakeholders. This House believes that is also unique in that, unlike other motions, such as this House will, you're not necessarily advocating for an action. Sometimes this House believes that motions are arguing about a belief or a principled stance. That being said, you can probably go a bit further in your speech by taking principled motions and grounding them in the real world by giving some practical implications of these motions. So some common points of clash for this House believes that motions are individual sovereignty versus collective good, radical versus palatable change, or short-term versus long-term interests. This House would. So in these kinds of motions, you're pushing for a group or a person to do some sort of action. So it's very important that you first talk about who this House is. Why do they want this? And what power do they have to enact this motion? So an example would be this House as the Democratic Party would, etc., etc., etc. You want to be thinking about what are the interests of the Democratic Party, which probably looks like being voted in, as well as pushing forward legislation. You also want to be thinking about where does the Democratic Party get their power. So even if this motion is beneficial towards writing good policy, if it's very controversial, it's not something that the Democratic Party would be likely to do because they get their power from being voted in by the general public, which passing very controversial bills is not conducive to. Other questions you want to be thinking about is what societal problem will this motion solve, and what are some side effects of this motion? So in government, you'd want to be talking about positive side effects, whereas more likely on opposition, you want to be talking about what are some negative side effects that are unintended from this motion. And finally, you want to be thinking about how will this motion impact other stakeholders. So using our example of this House as the Democratic Party, you also want to be thinking about how this motion can impact the voting public, how it can impact the people that your motion would probably be trying to help, and you also want to be thinking about how the Republicans can probably respond to this motion. For this House regrets motions, the most important thing to do is to make sure that you clearly paint what the two worlds look like. For this House regrets, the most important thing is to paint a very clear picture of what the two worlds that you are comparing looks like. That means A, what does our world under status quo look like? And B, what does the comparative look like? So we'll use another example. This House regrets the concept of marriage. So you want to explain, first of all, what is our world's perception of what marriage is and what are some rituals and norms around marriage. You also want to very clearly illustrate what would the world look like if marriage didn't exist. So that means how would relationships be formed and how would people in relationships interact, what that means for family units, etc. Usually this House regrets motions get pretty messy because of Gov and opposition teams debating around what does the comparative world actually look like. So just having a very clear picture of what the comparative world looks like could really clean up your debate. You also want to be thinking about what norms in our world will be fundamentally reshaped, because usually it's not just the thing that you are regretting that's going to be changed in the comparative world. Usually it also means that some fundamental ways about how society is shaped are also being changed. And depending on if you're on Gov or Op, these can be in good ways or in bad ways. Essentially what you're doing in a This House Regrets motion is comparing the two separate worlds. On Gov side, you want to be talking about how the comparative world is worse off for stakeholders, for example, or in the general setup of society. And on opposition, you want to outline what the problems with our world under status quo are and how eliminating this thing that you're regretting will eliminate these kinds of problems. For actor motions, which often look like this House as an individual or this House as an organization, it's very important that you paint a clear picture in your judge's mind about what does that individual or organization look like. So what are their goals and what are their priorities? Not only in terms of what do they care about, but also in terms of what do they not want. So because this motion is set from the point of view of a specific actor, you're not necessarily arguing for the benefit of other people or broader society, which is why it's most important that you clearly outline what you as an individual want and how this motion is going to get what the individual or the organization wants. After outlining your goals, you also want to explain how this motion would hinder or would help you reach your goals. Another thing to note is that although you're arguing from the point of view of a specific actor, it's fair for opposition to say that presumably your actor doesn't want to do something that harms society, or that they are still an altruistic person with the best intentions in mind. So you do want to consider the impact on other actors. You also want to talk about how the individual you're talking about fits into broader society. So even though a motion could be beneficial towards that person, if it's a very unpopular or a very selfish kind of action, it can probably lead to a lot of backlash from the general public. So you do want to consider how the actor fits into other stakeholders and broader society as you're talking about an actor motion. Now, to end off with some general advice. First of all, it's very important that you impact your arguments to make them especially strong. To give another example, it's one thing to say this motion is going to be bad for people of color. You can further impact that by explaining how exactly it's going to be bad for people of color. Does that look like institutional barriers, or maybe intangible perception from the public, or even something like harm to the self-confidence or self-actualization of a person of color? Along that same vein, it's important to avoid assertions and to give mechanisms when you're making a claim. So for example, you can make the argument that freeing up trade is going to help economic development. But it would be a much stronger argument if you give the mechanisms as to how freeing trade leads to economic development. So you can say something like, oh, if you have more exports, that means you have more cash inflows. That means that there's a generally wealthier population, and a wealthier population means a bigger taxable population. Having more tax money means that the government has more money to spend on infrastructure and educational programs, which ultimately leads to greater economic development. Finally, if time permits, or if you're really searching for something to say, you can probably find some holes in your own argument and preemptively rebut some of the arguments that will be brought up by following teams. This is especially helpful from an opening team because it helps you engage preemptively with some of the arguments that'll come out in the closing team.